Hello and welcome back to the second Q&A session. Thank you so much for all the brilliant questions that you asked last week. I've really enjoyed thinking about them, trying to sort of work out how best to answer them in order to provide help not only for the questioner but hopefully transferable advice and information for many people that are having sort of similar questions, ideas or difficulties with their painting. If you haven't seen the first Q&A, which I had fabulous feedback for and people found really helpful, there's a new collection started up here on Patreon, which is titled Q&A Sessions. So take a look there and you'll find the first Q&A there. And of course, this one will be included there too. So let's get on to the questions. The first question is from Richard, and he asks, what mixed media works well with watercolour? I sometimes see pastels and pencils being used, but I don't know how and when you'd incorporate them. And the simple answer to this question is any mixed media will go with watercolour. You can make anything go with anything. And of course, the only way to find out how to use it is to try. Instead of theorising about it, you have to sort of get your sketchbook out or the backs of old paintings and put different things together. If you like using pastels and pencils, then see how they work on top of watercolour or underneath watercolour. And nobody can really tell you what works with what, because what works for you might not be something that I enjoy doing, or what works for another artist might be something that inspires you, but when you try it out, you find that you don't enjoy the process. So it's really important to just get stuck in and try different things out. I'll talk you through a couple of examples from my work with the Coastguard cottages here. I put down a watercolour wash on top of Indian ink line work. And then once I had the watercolour wash down, I added more ink and more watercolour. So those were the two main components. And then once that part of the painting was done, I brought out the cottage and all the undergrowth surrounding the cottage using a mixture of white pastel, soft pastels, not oil pastels, so white pastels and white ink. So the mixed media elements here are quite important because they bring out the highlights. I've sort of covered the wall with white pastel and I've scribbled some white pastel across the foreground and then brought out some finer lines with white ink, working in and around the paint and the ink that's already there. This second painting of my local station uses the same components, a watercolour wash, there's Indian ink line work, and then highlights are created using pastel. So all the yellows and oranges and whites on this quite muted painting are created using, again, soft pastels. And the overpass details are created with white ink. So to sum up, just get stuck in and try different things out. Maybe get out some paintings that haven't quite worked and see what happens when you add mixed media elements to them. See what you can do, because you've got nothing to lose and lots to gain. The next question is from Lena, and she asks, how do you decide where your focal point is going to be when you use a photo as a reference? And the answer to this is quite simple. It's whatever you want it to be. It's whatever appeals to you in the photograph. It's what your eye is drawn to, and it's what makes you want to paint the painting. So there's no set answer to this. So if you were to decide the boat on the left would make a good focal point, you'd probably zoom in on that, make sure it was nice and detailed with lots of contrast so that the viewer's eye would be drawn to it, and everything else in the painting would be more muted. And likewise, if you wanted the red boat on the right to be the focal point, you'd zoom in on that and keep that as the main pop of colour, and the eye would be drawn to it. A useful tool to help you to get into practice of finding out good focal points from scenes is a square frame of cardboard, the sort of thing that you use to mount a photograph like this. And if you imagine this painting is a photograph, you can use this aperture and move it around and decide what it is that appeals to you and what makes the best focal point. Here it's the group of buildings. Here it's a different aspect of the buildings. That white building really pops. And let's just move that over. We could just exclude the buildings and make this a painting that's all about the trees. So the light behind the trees makes those trees really pop and turns them into the focus. And again, we can go over the other side and pick a completely different building, and that relationship between the trees and the buildings becomes the focus. So the simple answer is there's no hard and fast rules. It's whatever you're interested in the scene that will become the focus. Angela asks, "Hi Lois, I find when I start my warm-ups or even skies in general, I always do the same thing. It's like my brain defaults to the same movements all the time. Any tips and suggestions? Thanks." And yeah, I can relate to that. I think most of us can. I think it's something to do with the way our brains are programmed, is that when we learn to do something, we kind of learn muscle memory, and that's what's kicking in. And probably a good way to try and override this is to do something completely different, to try and change things up a bit. So the first suggestion would be try doing a sky practice using your non-dominant hand. So if you normally paint with your right hand, paint with your left. If you normally paint with your left hand, then paint with your right. And this should really change things up a bit. You'll fool your brain and find that you can probably begin to make some different marks and different movements. Another idea is to put all your paints into a bag and just pick out 3 or 4 at random and then practice painting the same scene that you normally would, but using these different colours. And that can be enough to change your brain's patterns and force you to think in a new creative way. John asks, "Hello Lois, I just wanted to ask whether your painting videos might at some point show you mixing paints in your palette before painting. I for one would find this helpful." Well, I'm afraid that's not really possible, John, and the main reason for that is I don't pre-mix paint before I start painting. And I never have. I'm an intuitive painter, and all I do is squeeze out the colours onto my palette that I think I might need, or ones that are calling to me, and then I wet the page and I start painting, and I colour mix as I go along. You never know, you might find that an interesting and exciting way to paint, so why not give it a try? But if not, the advice that I'd give you would be to mix up the colours you think you're going to need, but don't be too bogged down with trying to reproduce them exactly. Be flexible and be willing to make little tweaks and changes as you go along, and that way you'll find you'll become more involved, more engrossed in the colour mixing, and it'll become quite an intuitive thing for you too. Jan asks, "I would love some guidance about water control in painting. Thanks." And you're in luck, Jan. There is a huge series about water control. The feedback I had about it was really phenomenal. People have said it was one of the best series, and it covers water control in all aspects of watercolour painting. Well, as far as my experience goes. So water control in the paper, in the paint and in the brushes. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below, and I really hope that you'll find it helpful. The next question is from Lisa, and Lisa says, "Hi Lois, my question is about colour. I love Daniel Smith watercolours because there are so many beautiful and diverse ones. I know you use a minimal colour palette a lot of the time and mix your colours from those, and I understand the importance of learning how to do this. I just love having convenience colours on hand and have not mastered this process yet. I do hate not using my beautiful collection of watercolours. Do you have a method for mixing a larger variety of colours?" Yes, I do, and it's exactly the same as you would use for mixing a small number of colours, and that is pick out the colours, any number of colours that are appealing to you, that you like, and then play with those colours and see what they do, see how they work, see which colours go together and which ones don't, in your opinion, because that, of course, is all that counts. See what you like and what you don't like, and use the ones that you like. Or for a slightly more structured approach, try picking a warm and a cool version of each of the primary colours a warm and a cool version, excuse me, of each of the secondary colours, and a sort of an off-primary version. So, for example, for an off blue, you could have Payne's Grey. For an off red, you could have Burnt Sienna. And for an off yellow, you could have something like Yellow Ochre. And then play around with those and see what happens. There are many different ways, but the main way is pitch in, grab the colours that you love and play with them and see what happens. And make sure you write down notes about your findings so that you can repeat those experiments in your paintings as you take them forward. And good luck. I hope you enjoy working with what sounds like a wonderful range of watercolour paints. Yvonne asks, why do people use buff titanium or lavender? Seems to make things hazy. Well, maybe people use those colours because they want to make things hazy, because they're looking for that effect, or because they like the colours, or because they enjoy mixing sort of slightly more opaque colours in with their watercolour. People will use whatever colour they want to get whatever colour they need. And if they want a hazy effect, then those two colours are great. Another from Yvonne, if you want a really bright sun in the sky at sunset, do you paint around it, leaving a dry spot, or dampen the paper and then paint around it? Well, you could use either ways. Either ways sound like a really good way of producing those effects. But if you want it for a particular painting and if you've got a particular look in mind, then try out both methods in your sketchbook and then analyse what you like and don't like about each method, and then select the one that you like the best to use in your painting. Next up, a few questions from Trishna, and Trishna says, hi Lois, I'm a new member, but I love your tutorials so far and beautiful painting style. Thank you. I had a few questions. One, I see you use a fine rigger brush and also a very fine calligraphy brush, which seems to be about the same size. What do you find are the main differences between calligraphy, Asian style brushes versus Western in terms of the effects you can get painting with them, and why would you use one over the other? A rigger brush, or otherwise known as a liner brush or lining brush, has long flexible hairs so that you can hold a lot of paint inside that brush and you can draw very long lines without having to dip back into your paintbrush. And so for tree branches, ship's rigging, things like that, a rigger brush is preferable. It will give you that long straight line without you having to recharge your brush with paint. A calligraphy brush is much smaller hairs, it holds less paint, but its rounded shape gives some beautiful marks, and the tip enables you to paint some good detail. And most important, you can control the effects with the small round calligraphy brush far more than you can with a rigger brush, which is meant for long, fine, spontaneous lines. But the rigger brush is harder to control because those long, fine hairs are quite whippy and, as I say, give you fresher marks. And so the calligraphy brush is for more detail and controlled marks. So Trishna's next question is, I noticed you often mix raw sienna with blue for skies and seem to get a nice greyish colour. For me, when I do this, it turns green. I'm mixing raw sienna that's PY43 with ultramarine blue, and I see you use cobalt blue. Is it due to the different blues, or does raw sienna pigment vary from manufacturers? A true raw sienna is basically a brown, even though it looks yellow. It's a very light brown, and the one that I use is pigment number PBR7. That's a true raw sienna. So if you look for that, you'll find that it will not tend to mix to a green as you paint with it using any blue. Also, try to make sure that as you lay the brush strokes down for your sky, keep the brush strokes separate from each other. Allow the wet paper to help the paint to diffuse. If you scrub the paint too much, the blue into the raw sienna too much, you'll find you'll get a greenish tinge because you're actually actively mixing it, and it will go more towards a green if you overwork it. And Trishna's third question, I saw somebody else had a question about water control in painting. I struggle with this too sometimes. So I'd advise you to follow the link in the description below to the series on water control, and hopefully that should answer just about all of your questions. And with practice, you'll really build up your water control skills in all aspects of watercolour painting. Ros asks, I'd love to know about how you organise your workspace. What are your essentials for painting? How do you organise, store your supplies and work? Sketches, drawings, notes, finished works, etc. I'm constantly sorting through stuff and it takes a long time. Love to hear what's worked for you. Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to have a great answer for you. I'm completely disorganised. I have nothing to hand. Everything's just scattered around my studio. I live in a large open plan studio, so my living space is my studio space, and consequently things are everywhere. But it's kind of chaos that I understand and enjoy, but I'm afraid I've never been very good at organising things, so I don't actually have any tips or advice for that. Apart from one, I keep all my finished paintings in A3 display books. They're really cheap to buy and they don't take up much space when they're stacked up all together, and it's a great way of keeping your paintings, finished paintings, in an organised fashion. You could probably do the same with sketches as well. But I'm afraid other than that, everything that I'm currently working on is scattered around me, and things that I've worked on in the past is just sort of piled up in the studio area. But I know where everything is. It's disorganised chaos, but to me it's a comfortable way of working, so I'm really sorry that that's probably not the answer you wanted to hear. The next question is from Nick. I've just started buying loose sheets of cotton paper in 1/4 imperial size and cutting them in half again to make smaller pictures. It's much cheaper than buying pads and paper, and is generally better quality. The dimensions are different to what I use every day, in other words A4, A3 sheets for photographs or my printer. The question is, when you come to mount and frame your work, is there any standard size that you work to? For example, as you tape your paper down, are you conscious that you have to leave a defined width of border so that a mount will fit exactly over it? I'm finding the 1/8 imperial size very odd dimensions for any painting, but useful for a beginner like me to start with. I don't often frame and mount my paintings. The only times I do so is when they're accepted into an exhibition, and then I get mounts and frames made specifically to the size of the painting. I'm not aware of the size of the painting when I'm taping it. I'm just literally using the tape as a practical way of attaching the paper to the board. To me, I'm not really thinking about framing and mounting when I'm painting. When I sell paintings, it's usually by mail order, and these paintings aren't framed or mounted. They're simply carefully wrapped in cellophane and then put into a very strong cardboard tube, rolled into the tube and posted out to the client. And the client then will select the mount and the frame that best suits their decor. So I'm afraid I'm not really the best person to ask about this. A couple of suggestions would be to maybe go back to using pads and blocks in the appropriate size, because of course it's much cheaper to buy pre-made mounts and frames in the A3, A4, A5, etc. sizes. But if you do prefer to use the 1/4 imperial, it might be an idea to go and see your local framer and talk to them about it, and they may be able to do you a deal on the right size frames and mounts for 1/4 imperial. The next question is from Susan, and she says, I'm new to the channel, but I'm really enjoying learning. Like others, I'd like to understand more about colours, how you organise your palette, and should I group warm and cool colours together, and then how to use on the paper as layers. Also, my paper never stays stuck down. I use framing tape. Any hints? Many thanks. P.S. Also, when you do your YouTube videos, please can you detail the colours used in the details and the brushes used? So there's quite a bit there, but starting at the beginning, How to organise your palette. You can group your colours together in any way that's comfortable for you. If you want to organise cool and warm colours together or separately, it depends what you're comfortable with, what's easiest for you when it comes to colour mixing. And it might take a bit of trial and error before you get your palette organised in the right way that works for you. But the only way for you to be able to work out how to do that is through trial and error with your different colours organised in different ways. This is the way that I organise my colours and my palette. I've just got a big box full of paints. I grab the ones that I want to use and then squeeze them out on the palette. I don't actually have any method of organisation myself. I just choose the colours that I want to use and then mix them. And if I'm unsure about any particular colour mixes or how colours will layer, then I'll practice with those colours and try swatches out in my sketchbook or try layering them up to see how they work. And I'd advise you maybe to try the same, and the more you practice, the more familiar you'll come with how your colours work together. I tape my paintings down with ordinary decorator's masking tape that I purchase from eBay or Amazon. I've never used framing tape, so I'm afraid I can't advise about that, but maybe try masking tape. I've never had any problems with the tape coming off. I find it a really reliable way to create a border and tape the painting down. And as for listing all my colours and brushes used below my YouTube videos, I'm afraid I don't get the time for that. I detail the brushes and the colours meticulously throughout my painting. So my advice would be to, as you watch the video, pause it and make a note of the colours if you're interested in the exact ones that I use, and the same with brushes. Jane asks, when you're doing an abstract, are there ways to direct how it turns out? I love using a card and swiping across and seeing where it takes me, but are there ways to more purposefully direct things, e.g. amount of different paint, order? I end up with lots of snow scrapes. And I think here you've probably answered some of your questions here, and you just need to try and put them into practice. But the most important thing is, if you want to create a certain effect, a certain atmosphere, a certain type of weather, or use particular colours and create a certain scene, then you need to plan it and work out how you're going to incorporate the card swipe method into that, the colours you're going to use, and the order in which you will place them on the card. And of course that will take practice, it'll take experimentation in your sketchbook, and you can work towards using the card swipe in a very, very intentional and planned way. But of course, like every watercolour painting, the work that you do at the beginning in the sketching and the planning process is the important part, working out your colours, how to direct the card swipe, where to position it, how much water to use, etc., etc., and then what to do when you've created it. Becca says, "Hi Lois, I love the landscape tutorials you do, especially of the beautiful countryside around the UK. I wonder if you will do some more that contain little cottages or farm animals. They really do make a lovely scene." I sometimes include cottages in my landscape, so yes, I'll be continuing to do so. As for animals, it's not really my thing. It doesn't appeal to me to be painting flocks of sheep, herds of cows, that sort of thing. So I'm afraid I'm not your artist for that kind of thing. But you never know, I may see a scene that I like and then have a go at trying to include some animals in that scene. Now there's a question from Zara, and she says, "Dear Lois, I would love to be able to do, or rather suggest, trees a bit in the style of Edward Wesson. When I do the finer branches with a rigger, it is too defined, too stylised, I feel. Any suggestions?" As most people are probably aware, and if you aren't, then it's well worth researching this artist. Edward Wesson is admired and even revered in a lot of loose watercolour landscape painting circles. I think he must be one of the artists that's the most sort of emulated and admired and copied by people beginning their watercolour landscape journey. And the reason is that his work is pretty close to perfection from a less is more and loose watercolour painting kind of way, where details are suggested rather than overtly worked. And I think it would be impossible to come up with something similar to his work, because of course that's something he developed over the years, and a person's brushstroke and style is pretty much like handwriting. It's something that is unique to them. And I think the best way to try and learn about how he painted these beautiful trees is to do what's known as a sort of a master study. And this is where you take one of his paintings, any one that appeals to you, and really study it, really look at it carefully, and then try to work out how he painted the trees in the painting, if that's your focus. And then begin by making a copy. And if you're not happy with the results, then analyse what's happened and what's gone wrong. Practice the brush strokes that you feel aren't fluid enough. Alter the tonal values or the colours that you're using, etc., etc. And then go again. And to keep repeating this until you really feel like you've sort of learnt how to produce this style of tree, then you could be able to sort of move forward into your own work with those skills. And master studies can be really useful for this, not so much to get us to paint like the master, but to get us to understand the kind of skills we need in order to be able to paint similarly, but in our own style. And Sarah's second question is, would be interested in how to paint a crowd of people receding into the distance. Nearer ones are obviously bigger. What about the head heights? As the crowd recedes into the distance, the figures need to be painted with less detail. The head heights will all be about the same height. They'll be at eye level or on the horizon line. And that's as long as the ground is flat. And it's just a matter of practicing this. And also, the further into the distance your crowd goes, the more they will merge together. And so they will become more indistinct and smaller, paler, so that you bring aerial perspective into play as well. Bridget asks, "Hi Lois, I was given paint tubes that must be around 40 years old. No problem with those, but newer tubes are getting really difficult to open after a short time. At least certain brands, which I won't buy anymore. Do you have a routine with cleaning out paint tubes? I know the trick of putting them into warm water. Any more tricks?" I'm afraid not, but I share your pain, because that happens to me. The little bits of residue of paint builds up on the neck of the tube and almost sort of welds the lids to the tube, and it can be a problem. I think the only way that you can avoid this is by meticulously cleaning the neck of the tube and inside the lid, maybe with a cotton bud, a Q-tip, or some sort of rolled up paper towel when you finish using the tube, and that way you won't let the residue of paint build up to sort of weld the lid to the tube neck. The next question is from Rhonda, and she says, "I would like to have more instructions on drawing the outlines in landscapes, etc. I want to get better at this, but I get intimidated since I'm not very proficient at sketching. I don't really want to trace, as I want to learn the drawing skills well enough to sketch the landscapes that I see." And that's a great question, and it's something that's one of the hardest things to do as a beginner. So I'll just demonstrate that for you. I think it's one of the most important skills for landscape painting is learning to simplify what you see and turn it into a very simple sketch for a painting. And sadly, a lot of artists tend to want to skip this stage for some reason. I've got no idea why, because it's a real pleasure once you get into it and build the skills. Here we have quite a complex estuary scene with a railway bridge over the river and hills in the distance. We've got a yacht club on the bank and boats in the water. Squint your eyes at it and try and look at it as a series of planes of land. What we have to do is try and turn those planes of land into simplified marks and pencil lines. So the first thing that I would do here is I'd find my horizon line, which is at eye level. As I look across to the other bank of the river, I use a ruler and I put in that horizon line, and then I work out all my other planes of land around that. I put in a line, or sort of a sketchy line, following the shape of the hills at the background. I'll use a ruler again to put in that railway bridge, just an indication of where it goes. And then I'll build up the bank that runs from the left of the railway bridge and comes all the way along the painting, following lines of perspective, so it becomes a little bit larger towards the left-hand side of the painting. And then lastly, I'll position my boats and try and get the shapes of the boats right. Remember, you're not painting boats themselves, but you're painting the shapes these boats make. And the shapes they make aren't exactly boat-shaped, but once you put them together, using the shapes that you see, not what you think you see, you'll end up with something that's surprisingly realistic. So if you watch this time-lapse of me sketching out the scene, you can see that I'm not being too careful. I'm being very, very sketchy and scribbly. And this is the way of sort of roughing in the position of parts of your painting without being too precious or worried about perfection. That's not what a sketch like this is all about. It's simplifying. It's making sure that everything fits onto the paper. It's making sure that everything works in balance. And of course, you can erase anything that isn't right, and then just keep going until you will suddenly realise that you have everything in place and you've got a fine roadmap for your painting. But this isn't something that you can learn overnight. It's not something that I can teach you. No artist can teach you how to sketch. They can give you advice as to how they do it, but it's up to you to find the way that's right for you. But hopefully this has given you a few pointers as to how to begin simplifying a complex scene. Robin asks, I have trouble replicating a painting I really like. Trouble is putting it mildly. I realise that a big part of the wonder of watercolour is its capacity for doing its own thing. But is there anything we can do other than paint more to increase the likelihood that a second painting of the same plan will turn out as good as better than the previous one? How do we get more keepers instead of more stuff for the collage bin? So, of course, as you've acknowledged here, watercolour isn't a media in which you can make exact reproductions. Because of the nature of the way watercolour flows on the page, it's always going to look different. But you can increase the odds of creating something similar if you're happy with a painting by using tracing to trace your outline. If you trace your outline, which of course you've created anyway, so it's your own, so tracing it is perfectly fine, then you're using exactly the same outline to transfer across onto your watercolour paper, and this gives you the opportunity to have your basic foundational framework exactly the same. I'd also suggest that if you think you're going to want to redo a painting that you like, while it's still fresh in your mind, make some quite detailed notes about how you achieved the effects you did, the colours that you used, any particular points that were quite difficult and that you had to use sort of different techniques for. Make notes about those in a sketchbook, and then when you come to repeat the process, you'll have information that's going to be really useful. But I think the most important thing is don't put too much pressure on yourself. If we're trying to recreate a painting that we really like, I think we kind of slow down, we go a bit careful, and we can almost like squeeze the life and the energy out of a painting by doing that, which is why it ends up sort of flat and lifeless. So if you can create the same sort of energy that you used when you painted the first painting, you're more likely to have it looking fresh and beautiful. The last question is from Dan St. Pierre, and it's how did you discover your own personal style? Now, my own personal style is something I believe I've always had, and by practicing and painting many paintings, sketching multiple times, that my style has become more developed. There's a lot of confusion about style, especially with beginners. I think some beginners confuse style with genre. Or sort of way of painting. For example, they think that they don't know whether they want to paint landscapes, pet portraits, flowers, whether they want to paint in an illustrative style or an abstract style or a loose style. Now, that is all still called style, but it isn't your own personal style, I believe. I believe your personal style is something that you always have, and it's only developed fully through practice. It's similar to your handwriting. It's unique to you, and it's something that comprises the unique way you make marks on the paper, the unique way that only you will use your brushes and a combination of brushes that's unique to you, your colour choices and the way you mix them. Even if they're the same as another artist, you'll mix them in a way that is unique to you. Only you sees the world through your eyes. So I'd argue that I didn't find my style, I just developed the style that I already had. And it doesn't matter what genre I paint in, other words, industrial landscapes like these, abstract landscapes, seascapes, whether I paint flowers or portraits, my style will run through as a common thread through all the different types of paintings that I explore. My style is simply me developing the way that I see the world and translating that in my own unique way onto the paper. So if you're worried about finding your own personal style, don't worry, you've already got it. You just need to put in the painting miles and it will develop naturally without you worrying about it. So that just about wraps it up and brings us to the end of this second Q&A session. And thank you so much to everybody that submitted questions. It's fascinating to read your questions, and hopefully I've provided some information, some answers and some ideas here that you'll find helpful, interesting and maybe a bit inspiring too. And don't worry if you missed out on asking a question this time. These are going to be a regular feature every month or so. So keep an eye on the videos that I post on Patreon, because there'll be another call for requests in a month or so. So thank you again so much for your support here on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. Take good care of yourselves, stay well, stay happy, stay creative, and I'll see you again soon. And happy painting. Bye.